Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Quest for Truth. Today we are looking at Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 18, and we're going to start with the first 8 verses. Now he was also saying to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called him and said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes." And he summoned each one of his master's debtors. And he began saying to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said to him, "Take your bill, and sit down quickly, and write 50. And he said to another, "How much do you owe?" And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, "Take your bill, and write 80. And his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwelling." So this parable here of the unrighteous steward or manager begins. There's this rich man, and he has a manager, someone who controls a certain part of his wealth or his estate. And it was reported to the rich man that this manager was squandering his possessions. Now, the word squandering there is the same word right back in the previous chapter with the prodigal son. The prodigal son had squandered all of his wealth. And so that's the same word. He had squandered his manager's wealth, his possessions. And so the manager called him forward, and he told him to give an account of his management. And so this gives the manager some amount of time to be able to kind of figure out what he's going to do. He knows he's going to get fired, basically, and he says that he's not physically able or strong enough to dig, to do manual labor. He's ashamed to beg. In other words, he's not fit to do really any other job. So what is he to do? And so before he's removed from management, before he's removed from managing this rich man's wealth, he goes to those who owe his master a debt, and he takes their bill and he changes it, and he has them change the 100 measures of oil down to 50, and another 100 measures of wheat down to 80. And so he reduces the debt that these people owe his master, so that when he is removed from that position, they will then accept him and be able to repay him for what he did for them, that wealth that they no longer owe the rich man. Now they can at least pay back somewhat to this man. And at the end of it, it says that his manager praised the unrighteous, or his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. So he's not praising the act that he had committed, right? And it says that the unrighteous manager. So it's not even the rich man isn't admiring what he did. He's not saying that was the right thing to do necessarily, but he is admiring the shrewdness, the ability of this man to act in a way that would gain him something in the end. And then it says, "For the sons of this age are more shrewd in relation to their own kind than the sons of light. And then Jesus here says in verse 9, and I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. And again, we're going to get more into this as we move ahead, but this parable here, Jesus isn't saying that, unrighteous behavior is good, and he's going to really get to kind of the opposite of that in a minute here. But what he's saying here is that the unrighteous use their wealth, or in this case, someone else's wealth. They unrighteously act and take what even isn't theirs in order to get themselves ahead, in order to make friends, in order to promote themselves, in order to gain wealth. But he says that we should use the wealth of unrighteousness. We should use, that same kind of idea, this earthly money and stuff, so that when it fails, and it's not if it fails, it's when it fails, it's going to fail. The all of the physical possessions in this life are going to fail. They're not going to last. But do this so that they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. In other words, use what you have in this world for the eternal things. Use it to promote the kingdom, and we're going to get more into that as well. And he really expands on that in the next few verses here. He says, he who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much, and he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is unrighteous also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust the true riches to you? And if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. So he presents now these two differing things, right? The faithful who is faithful in little, and the unrighteous who is unrighteous in little. And he says each of these, how they use little is how they will use more. If they're given more, they will use it in that same manner. Right? And so if we're not faithful in little, we won't be faithful in much. And then he says, no servant can serve two masters. And so we are either serving God, or we are serving the physical riches of this world. And it's really interesting because in this next part, he kind of almost, it continues to expand on this idea. He says, now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, were listening to all these things and were scoffing at him. And he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves in the sight of men, but God knows your hearts. For that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. And so these Pharisees really prove his point that you cannot serve both God and wealth. The Pharisees were lovers of money. They were serving money. They were trying to present themselves as holy. They were trying to do all these things, but really they wanted the power, they wanted the physical wealth that came along with that, and they were scoffing at him. Again, I don't know how many times I point this out, but Jesus here is God. And so as he's telling them this, they're scoffing at him. They're rejecting God as he is speaking in their presence. And so you really see that the variation there between serving God and serving wealth. Of they are serving wealth, they are lovers of money, and therefore they despise God. They despise what he's saying. They turn against him. They justify themselves, but God knows their heart. And so at this point, it begins to kind of turn a little bit or expand. It's not just about wealth, right? It says, God knows the heart, for that which is highly esteemed among men is detestable in the sight of God. And then it continues to say, the law and the prophets were proclaimed until John. Since that time, the gospel of the kingdom of God has been preached, and everyone is forcing his way into it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter of the law to fail. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. And so, again, he's expanding this from saying it's not just about money, it's not just about wealth, it's about our hearts, it's about really everything. You know, if you're unfaithful in little, you'll be unfaithful in much. That doesn't necessarily just mean your wealth. It means everything. It means your time, it means your talents, it means everything that God has given you. And so he starts talking about the law. The law and the prophets were proclaimed until John, and then the gospel of the kingdom of God has been preached. And everyone is forcing their way into it. Everyone who is following after Jesus is gaining entry into the kingdom of God. But he says, it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of the letter of the law to fail. And so the law still stands. Now, we always say that, Christ fulfilled the law, and that's, of course, true. However, the law, when we think about the law, we have to remember that the law was given to show us our sin. It's a mirror. And in it, we see that we are sinners. We have fallen short of God's glory. We have failed to keep it, and we are now guilty before God, before our Creator, before the authority, the greatest authority. And that guilt brings us to death because of the greatness of the one who we are responsible to, God. And so he says, no letter of the law, even the smallest letter of the law, shall not pass away. And so the law still stands. Again, we were talking about, those who are faithful and those who are unrighteous. And now we're talking about those who are, believing in the gospel of the kingdom of God, as Luke calls it here. And those who are believing in the law, or believing in themselves, really, to uphold the law. And that's what the Pharisees were doing. We see that, there are those who are trying to justify themselves, and they're trying to pretend as though they keep the law. They're and maybe trying to. They're certainly leading people into keeping the law themselves. But yet we know that even at breaking the law at one point is breaking the whole law. And so even the smallest breaking of the law makes you responsible for the entire consequences of the law, which is death. And he even, in verse 18 there, it seems a little out of place, but it was probably, it was something that even from the beginning, when you think about when the law was given in Exodus, there was an exception given for divorce in marriage, because it was, when what God has brought together, let no man separate. But then the people came to him and were like, well, what about if this happens or that happens? And so, there was the exception of divorce given if one party commits adultery. And so that's what, again, throughout history, right, people have been breaking this covenant of marriage. We see that now. The divorce rate is almost 50%. And so this is, at the time it was something that, the people were bringing and allowing divorces for very minuscule things that weren't legally a cause for divorce. And so this was a law that people were breaking that was not necessarily seen as them breaking the law. And so he says, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries one who is divorced from a husband commits adultery. They're breaking the law. They've broken that law, and they therefore are now responsible for the entire law. And so what's the point of this? Why is all of this here? Well, it's, we started off with this parable of this shrewd man who even though he was acting unrighteously, he was doing so in order to promote his physical wealth, to be able to survive, to make friends so that he could continue to live, essentially. But then we switch and we see that Jesus is telling us as believers that we are to be faithful. We are to use our wealth not for self-aggrandizement, self-promotion, but for the kingdom. We're to use what we've been given, what he's given us, to steward for the eternal reality that is the kingdom of God, to bring others into the kingdom, to evangelize, to tell people the good news of the gospel, and to disciple others, and to teach them the ways of God, to continue this cycle of evangelism, discipleship, and to not be a servant of wealth, but rather to serve God with our wealth, to serve God not just with our money, not just with our, the things that we have, the physical things, but with our time and with everything that he's given us. We are to use those things to glorify him, to serve the kingdom, and ultimately to serve him. And that's who we are as believers. We are servants of God. We are his children, and so we serve him with all that he has given us.